Let me just record the session.
Yes, of course.
Did recording start already? Yes. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
So once again, thank you very much, Mike, for accepting our invitation to be a guest speaker in our session. We're very happy about that. So today, and thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. There will be other people probably coming on as we start. So today, Mike is going to talk about the 3 M's, right? So metaphor, metonymy, and meronymy. The corpus-informed perspective, if I remember it right, yes?
Yeah.
Okay, I guess it's a topic that brings together many people studying language, whether, from the literary point of view, linguistic, or teaching, education, it doesn't matter. Okay, Mike, so it's over to you.
Well, thank you, Noordan. I hope everyone can see my screen. Noordan has just mentioned the title, and I'll explain how I came to arrive at this title. I was completing a book about English vocabulary, and I wanted to write a chapter about figurative uses of vocabulary. And I found that it wasn't as easy as I thought. In fact, it was one of the most difficult chapters of the book. And I want to explore some of the reasons why it was difficult for me. So in a way, I'm not coming to you with answers. I'm coming to you to present what was for me quite a problem. So the book was all about vocabulary. I don't want to advertise it anymore, but it's coming out in about 3 months with the publisher Routledge. And the chapter was all about figurative meaning. So the very first thing I had to do was to research the whole question of what figurative meaning is. And this led me to some definitions about particular kinds of figurative meaning, and in particular, what I've called the 3 M's. Because if you're going to study meanings which are not literal, which are in some way creative and figurative, then you always come back to these 3 major M's. The most common, of course, is metaphor. And I've put here a definition from the Cambridge Dictionary online. And they define it as an expression often found in literature that describes a person or object by referring to something that is considered to have similar characteristics to that person or object. Okay, so far so good. Meronymy is described as the relationship of a word that denotes a part of a thing to a word denoting the whole. The interesting thing about this, and this I'll come back to later, is that meronymy, the word meronymy, is not in the Cambridge Dictionary, and it's not in the American Merriam-Webster Dictionary. So you could say 2 major dictionaries do not even bother to mention this word. The OED, the Oxford English Dictionary, does have it, and that's where this definition came from. So in other words, you have to go to a very big dictionary to find a definition of this word if you are an ordinary member of the public who might come across the word. It describes a part-whole relationship, so we could talk about the parts of the human hand, the nails, the fingers, the palm, the parts of a car, the engine, the windscreen, the wheels, the seats, the gears. So in a way, it's a very simple meaning relationship. So we might be surprised that the word itself seems to be just a highly technical word, only used by people like us, by linguists. The 3rd M is metonymy. And in this case, we do find it in the Cambridge Dictionary online. And it's defined as the act of referring to something using a word that describes one of its qualities or features. So the example I've put here on the right is you see a soldier arriving and you say, aha, here comes the army. Only one soldier, but you say, here comes the army. Or you say, the police have issued a statement. And what you really mean is that one police officer issued a statement representing the whole organization of the police force. But I'll just repeat that point that metaphor and metonymy are in the Cambridge Dictionary Online. Now, the Cambridge Dictionary Online is a very good dictionary. I use it all the time. It's one of the easiest dictionaries to use, but it only has two of these three terms. So there's something special about meronymy, which the dictionary considers is not sufficiently important to include. Okay, so those are the three areas that I was looking at when I was writing about figurative meaning. I'm just going to put the same definitions again, and this time highlight certain words. The definition of metaphor includes a statement often found in literature. And of course, for many, many centuries, metaphor was considered a literary or rhetorical device. It wasn't considered something that ordinary people used in their language. So when I started as a student, as an undergraduate, I was studying literature, and metaphor was considered one of the important tropes, one of the important figures of speech that we find in great literature. Meronymy I've already mentioned. The significant thing here is that it is not in the dictionary. Metonymy, I've highlighted here that the word or expression, which is a metonym, describes one of its qualities or features. So we're essentially concerned with the qualities or features of something, and we just choose one. We just choose one particular thing. So that's rather important. What is it that makes us choose a particular quality or feature as an expression to create this figurative meaning? Okay, so those definitions look very simple, but they hide quite complex notions. We're going to look at the three M's in action: metaphor, meronymy, and metonymy. They are all involved in the creation of figurative meaning. I've already used that word several times. The problem is that all three overlap with the basic notion of idiomaticity and what we mean by idioms in a language. So already we're seeing that things are not simple. They are not simple compartments. You cannot study these three things without looking at the whole notion of idiomaticity. What are idioms? How do they operate in the vocabulary of a language? And in the case of today, the vocabulary of English. What I found when I was researching this is that it is not a simple matter to define literal versus non-literal meaning, literal versus figurative meaning. You would think it would be easy and straightforward, but it's not at all. Most linguists seem to agree that a non-literal, that is, a figurative interpretation, tends to depend on several factors interacting. In other words, factors operating at once. There is not one single factor which enables us to say, this is figurative, it's not literal. So one factor is salience. That is, the expression in some way stands out in the text. It kind of hits us. The text is proceeding in its normal way, and suddenly there is something that seems to stand out. So salience is one of the factors that makes us think maybe this is a figurative meaning. Relevance is another. if we are struck by an expression and think, well, how can that be relevant to the present situation? Then if it is not immediately literally relevant, so it's not a matter of fact. So if I say the train left the station at 7 o'clock, that all seems to be entirely relevant to somebody giving me information about the time the train left. But if I say the train left the station like a great snake, then immediately I think, well, what's the relevance of snakes to railways and to a train leaving the station? So because I have to search for relevance, that is when I say, well, this is a figurative meaning. I have to start to think of the train as moving like a snake along the railway tracks. Of course, another factor is counterfactuality, something that is literally impossible. So again, a train is not a snake, and even if it looks like a snake, this is something, to call it a snake is to, if you like, to break the truth, to tell a lie. It is counterfactual. But all these factors work together. It's not just one of them. Something can be salient without being non-literal. It can be irrelevant without being non-literal, and it can be counterfactual without necessarily being non-literal. It could just be, again, a lie. All right, so what am I trying to do in this talk? What's my aim? I've got two aims. The first one is to use corpus evidence to see how these concepts might interrelate. And the second one, and this is a very important one for me, is to examine corpus evidence for the public perception or understanding of these three M's, these three tropes. Now, why do I do this? Well, over recent years, I've become much, much more concerned with the idea that if we call ourselves applied linguists, we have a duty to reach out to people outside of our universities. One of the problems with universities like yours and my own is they tend to be echo chambers. We talk to one another. We exchange ideas with one another. Of course we do. That's how we advance our disciplines. But I've become much, much more interested in how far do the ideas that we talk about penetrate and reach out to people out there, people outside of the university. And a corpus is a good place to look at the currency of the terms, the terminology that we use to see how far it extends into the public consciousness. So, for example, everybody talks about grammar. You know, any person in the street will have some idea of what you mean if you talk about grammar or accent or pronunciation. But I don't think I could walk out of my house and stop somebody in the street and say, how are your collocations? Or how is your phonological juncture today? So we have this division between our world, our technical terminological world, and the people out there who all use language. Every one of us is a language animal. And the public in general has some idea of how to talk about language. And I'm very interested in the extent to which it is important for us to understand what the public understands, not just to understand what our colleagues in the university departments understand. Now, I probably won't be able to achieve everything about these two aims, but those are the two things that come out of this problem of the 3 M's. Let's go back then to the first M, metaphor. And yes, the dictionary said metaphor is something you find in great literature. And for any English speaker, what could be greater than William Shakespeare? And indeed, it's very easy to find metaphors in Shakespeare. My first quotation here is a wonderful definition of love from Shakespeare's Sonnet 116. Love is an ever-fixed mark that looks on tempests and is never shaken. It is the star to every wandering bark. Come back to that in a minute. The next quotation from Shakespeare is, all the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances. And one man in his time plays many parts, his act being 7 ages. So if you look at the first quotation here, I've highlighted some of the words. Love is an ever-fixed mark. Well, it's very strange, of course, to call love a mark. What is it? Some kind of horrible stain that you want to remove with a chemical, or what is it? Or is it something that touches you and remains with you? So immediately we're trying to find relevance for this. You know, how could this be relevant to love? How could love possibly be a mark? And it's salient, it jumps out of the text. What a strange thing to say about love. Love is an ever-fixed mark. It's something that never changes. But then we have something a little more familiar. It is the star to every wandering bark. And bark here has nothing to do with dogs. Bark here means a boat, a ship, okay? It's just an old word for a ship. So love is the star that guides every ship. And that, of course, is easier to understand, much easier than love is an ever-fixed mark. So here we have good classic examples of metaphor. So if you are a student of literature, you say, yes, this is what Shakespeare is saying, that love is like a star which guides a ship. So when you are in love, you look to this star for guidance of how you're going to act, all the things you're going to do, the way you're going to behave, etc. The second quotation is slightly more complex. All the world is a stage. So Shakespeare says, yes, the world is just like a theatre. All the men and women are players. So he now tells us the whole human race are the actors in this theatre. They leave the stage and they come onto the stage. They have their exits and entrances. Then he changes and he says, one man in his time plays many parts. His acts being 7 ages. So he's dividing our life into 7 parts. But what's really interesting here is Shakespeare goes from all the human race to just one man. So already we can see that this is a bit like Here Comes the Army. We see one soldier and we say, here comes the army. What Shakespeare is saying is we see one man or one woman, if we were in a more tolerant time, that one person plays many parts. So this one person is now looking more like an example of metonymy rather than an example of metaphor. And this was one of the things that began to interest me, you know, how do you separate them, metaphors from metonyms? Or perhaps we shouldn't separate them. Perhaps we should say that a metaphor can act as a metonym and vice versa, that metonyms are a kind of metaphor, if you like. So already I was beginning to get more confused than I had hoped when I was writing my book. You see, when you publish a book, people think, oh gosh, yes, that person's ideas are very, very clear. Well, the truth is, of course, that it's the exact opposite. The more you try to write about something, the more you begin to see the complexity in it. And if you are one of the PhD students who are with us here today, then I'm sure you will experience that at some point or another. I know that my dear friend Noordan certainly experienced that when she was doing her PhD thesis, that the more she researched, the more complicated and complex it seems to get. So the advice is don't panic, don't worry if something is looking complicated and complex, because it is complicated and complex. Now, one of the most important developments in the study of metaphor was to take it away from the world of literature and to bring it somehow into our ordinary everyday lives. And the most famous work in this connection was by Lakoff and Johnson, published in 1980. And this particular quotation comes from the edition published in 2003 on page 3. And this is what Lakoff and Johnson say about metaphor. Metaphor is for most people a device of the poetic imagination and the rhetorical flourish. So they admit that for most people, metaphor is something you associate with high literature, with poetry, with Shakespeare, with something extraordinary, a matter of extraordinary rather than ordinary language. Okay? Then Lakoff and Johnson say, we have found on the contrary that metaphor is pervasive. It's everywhere. We find it everywhere in everyday life, not just in language, and here's the important thing, but in thought and action. Our ordinary conceptual system, in terms of which we both think and act, is fundamentally metaphorical in nature. Now, this is a very big claim. It's saying that our way of thinking and acting is itself a metaphor. It's not language which is the metaphor. If you like, it is our minds. Our whole social action is in some ways metaphorical. Everything becomes a metaphor. Now, if we take that line, things become even more difficult because we're saying, even before we speak, our concepts, our ways of thinking are basically metaphorical. It is pervasive in everyday life, in thought and in action. Our ordinary conceptual system is fundamentally metaphorical in nature. Okay, well, let's have a look at that a little more. What Lakoff and Johnson were saying was that our ways of thinking about things, our ways of organizing our thoughts, are often best expressed by comparing one phenomenon, one event, one series of actions to another phenomenon which we know about. So I've chosen this example, which was one of the ones I was researching. Reacting to difficulties is like doing a battle. It's like being a soldier and fighting a battle. And I've got some examples here from newspapers and websites. So look at this example here. The threatened revolt, this is a political report. The threatened revolt fizzled out as conservative critics decided to draw back from voting down the whole budget, keeping their powder dry for future votes. So what we have here is we are saying that political debate is like firing a gun, an old-fashioned gun, a cannon, you know, from Shakespeare's time. And you have to use gunpowder. And the important thing is, of course, that gunpowder only works if it is dry. If it gets wet, you can't fire your gun. So in a debate, in other words, a political debate, you have to keep your powder dry. You have to, if you like, have your gun ready to fire against your enemies, your critics. Another example, a very ordinary example, which I'm sure you've all said at some point in your life, I was battling to get through the traffic. So driving in a busy city is like fighting in an army. You're trying to win through the traffic. You're trying to get out in front of the other cars and get back in and so on. I'm sure this never happens in Turkish cities. I'm sure the traffic is beautifully organized and everybody drives perfectly with good manners. No, of course not. In all cities, traffic is like a battle. Here's another one. The culture of our country has been besieged by rules and regulations. And now we are saying that our culture is like a battle of 1,000 years ago, where the army would stand outside a castle and stay there for weeks or months until everybody inside the castle was hungry or ran out of ammunition and had to surrender. And here's a last one. There has been a High Court case recently which has, oh, this is somebody speaking, that's why it's a bit, the speaker says there has been a High Court case recently which seems to have torpedoed the prospect of including affordable housing in new housing deals. So that's the spoken one. These are taken from the British National Corpus of 1994. So what I've highlighted here are, in the first one, these verbs which refer to firing a gun, a cannon. Fizzled out means it didn't work, it just went and died. Keeping your powder dry so that you can use your gun. The second one, battling. The third one, besieged, which is what used to happen hundreds of years ago when armies would surround a castle. And torpedoed, like an underwater torpedo fired from a submarine. So these are ordinary everyday reports. This is not Shakespeare. These are simply newspapers, and in the third case, the fourth case, somebody actually speaking. So what have we got? Yes, we've got salience, with low frequency words, fizzled out. It's quite a low frequency word. Keeping their powder dry, I would classify this simply as an idiom. It's an idiom because it is a frozen form. You can't change it in any way. It has all the qualities of an idiomatic expression. Battling, perhaps a more frequent word, but you are trying to make it relevant to the idea of traffic, battling through traffic. The only way you can make it relevant is if the traffic is very dense and very heavy and you are trying to get home or you're trying to get to your destination. So we have examples of salience, of what we can call a classical idiom. Relevance is brought in here. Besieged against salient, it's not a very common word, very low frequency word. Torpedoed, again, not a very common word, and you have to make it relevant. How on earth can a torpedo be relevant to the government's policy on housing for people? So you see, all of these things are coming in. Counterfactuality, nobody fired a torpedo. It wasn't a real torpedo, nothing exploded, etc. Nobody stood outside a castle. Nobody had gunpowder when they were in the political debate in the parliament. So these are very ordinary, everyday examples. And they tell us a couple of things. They tell us, firstly, that metaphor certainly is not only found in literature, but they also tell us, secondly, that we construct these, what Lakoff and Johnson called conceptual metaphors. That is, they are conceptual frameworks, if you like. Think of them like the frame of a picture, conceptual frameworks in which you can draw in vocabulary from a particular domain in order to create organized meaning. So in this case, the speaker and the writers have taken vocabulary from the domain of war and battle and put it into different contexts: political debate, traffic, culture, and the law, the High Court. So there are three different areas of our lives, but the same conceptual organization is governing or controlling the discourse. So indeed, metaphor seems to be there in everyday life. We don't have to go to literature to look for it. Let's move on to Meronymy, because time is marching on, and as Nurdan said earlier, she thinks I could talk forever. Well, I can't talk forever, but I can talk for a while, because I'm very interested and passionate about my own subject. And again, you PhD students, you've got to have a bit of passion about your subject. You've got to, you've got to like it, and I like this subject. So let's have a look at Meronymy, and I've chosen here as examples of Meronymy, I've chosen the human body and all the various parts of the human body. And what is interesting about these parts of the human body is that almost every one of them gives rise to an idiom of some sort. So if you look at this funny diagram here, we've got the head, and we can talk about heading for a place. We've got the ear. You can lend an ear to somebody to listen to them. You can give somebody the cold shoulder. You don't want to talk to them. You don't want to interact with them. You can get something off your chest. That is, there's something important you want to tell somebody, and finally you tell them. You can, of course, hand something over. Something can be very expensive and cost an arm and a leg. You can be realistic and keep your feet on the ground, not be engaging in fantasies. You can see eye to eye with someone, to agree with them, to think the same way. You can nose around, that is, enter into areas of privacy that should not concern you. You can be neck and neck with someone, absolutely equal with them. Sorry, this might not be fully visible. Something can be very long. It can be as long as your arm. I hope this talk of mine will not be as long as your arm, but it may be the way it's going. You can put your thumb out on the road and thumb a lift from somebody. You can run away from something. If you're in a restaurant and you don't want to pay for your meal, you can leg it and hope that the waiter doesn't catch you. And you can obey all the rules and regulations and toe the line. Okay, so as we go around the human body, and this is not a complete list, there is a huge number of idiomatic expressions. So they are idiomatic because they are fixed and they are non-literal. But what is really interesting about them is that the human body idioms very much tend to work as metonyms. So you don't lend both ears, you just lend one ear. You don't, if you're in a race and the two of you are exactly the same in the race, you don't say body to body, you just say neck and neck. If I hand over responsibility or hand over the control of this seminar to Nurdan, I don't just use my hand, it's my whole responsibility which transfers to Nurdan. If you nose around in somebody's apartment or somewhere private, you don't just put your nose in there, it involves the whole body. If you see eye to eye with someone, it's not just your eye, it's your whole mind which agrees with the other person. So these surely are classic metonyms. So the human body, all of these parts of the human body are meronyms. Yes, they're all parts. We have different parts to our body, just as there are different parts to a car. But we tend to like to use them as metonyms rather than simply as metaphors. We talk about the human body being idiom prone. That is, that all the parts of the human body, because that's something all humans share, all the parts of the human body tend to create idioms. You know, they are something which easily translates into idiomatic language. So we have here a blend. We have the fact that the human body is involved in the creation of a number of idiomatic expressions. We also have the evidence that these idiomatic expressions operate metonymically, not just meronymically. So they are meronyms, they are parts of the body, but they are acting as representing the whole person, the whole body. So it's just like seeing one soldier and saying, here comes the army. They are metonyms. And there they are, one ear, the neck, the hand, the nose, the eye, all representing something very big. And remember, our first definition of metonym is that it is a choice of a particular quality or feature of something. So it seems to be a natural choice to choose the ear as the quality of listening and understanding, the neck as the quality of how in a race you can in fact put your neck forward and win the race by a little couple of centimeters. The hand as being the quality of giving something to another person. The nose is an interesting one. Why we choose the nose, I suppose it's because when you're looking at something private, you're doing this and your nose is the most prominent feature. And the eye, because if you agree with someone, you can look them straight in the face. So we have, even in the ordinary world of the human body, we have quite a lot of complexity in the vocabulary. But at this point in my research, I was beginning to understand something. And that is that what we think of as figurative language comes about when certain ways of using vocabulary interact. That, in other words, they are not separate compartments. They interact with one another to create the whole. The product, the whole, might be an idiomatic expression, such as these here. But inside those idiomatic expressions, we have metaphors, and we have meronyms, and we have metonyms. They are all inside the idiomatic expression. So in other words, I was learning something about idioms. Now, I've written books and papers in the past about idioms and just said, well, here they are, they're fixed forms and they mean something non-figurative. But I'm beginning now, by looking at corpus evidence, to understand something a little bit more about how idioms work. The best source of information about metonyms, about metonymy, is Janet Littlemore's book published in 2015. And I've taken this quotation from the first page of Janet's book. Metonymy is a cognitive and linguistic process through which we use one thing to refer to another. Well, we stop there and we say, well, surely that's how metaphor works. We use one thing to refer to another. Yeah, so what's the difference between a metaphor and a metonym? For example, says Janet, we might use the word Hollywood to refer to mainstream American films, or the word Shakespeare to refer to plays and poetry by Shakespeare. So if I say something like, oh, I found a wonderful quotation in Shakespeare, what I mean is, of course, in one of Shakespeare's plays or poems, somewhere in his whole work. In these examples, a place and a person are used to refer to things that are strongly related to that particular place and that particular person. So now we begin to understand the difference between a metaphor and metonyms, between metaphor and metonymy. In the case of metonymy, the quality which you choose must be strongly related to that particular place or person. So think back to our example of the train left the station like a great snake. There's not a strong relationship there between a train and a snake. Not at all. But there is a strong relationship between an ear and listening to somebody. There is a strong relationship between a hand and handing over responsibility or handing over power. So the special quality of metonymy is that it has to be something that is very closely related. But metaphor, you can fly like a bird, you can create, you can go wherever you like. And of course, that is what poets and other creative writers do. They create new relationships, whereas metonymy chooses a particular example of an existing relationship and uses that to represent the whole activity or the whole person in the case of the human body. So there I've highlighted the two phrases which are most important. We use one thing to refer to another. So, that's what we do when we create a metaphor. But the difference being that things that are strongly related to that particular place and that particular person are chosen. In the case of Hollywood, Hollywood is strongly related to the film, the movie industry, and Shakespeare is strongly related to his own plays and poetry. Okay, so I hope it's beginning to get a little bit clearer now, but I don't want it to be too clear because at the end of this talk, I want you to realize that it is in fact quite a complex question. So I went to my corpus, and this is what we should always do if we can. When we think we know how something works in language, we have to check it out and see, well, is that true, or is it only partly true, or is it more or less always true? So I've taken the example from Janet Littlemore's previous quote that I used, the example of Hollywood. And I looked it up in the British National Corpus, and I took a random sample of 100 occurrences of the word Hollywood in the British National Corpus of 1994. And I chose a sub-corpus, a collection of what are labeled informative texts. Now, I did this deliberately because I did not want to choose literary texts. I wanted texts from the corpus which were information texts. So these are texts from newspapers and books and various other things. They are not from literature. If you use the British National Corpus, you will see that the texts are labeled with different labels, such as fiction or speaking or informative. And I chose the informative texts. Only 7 of the 100 references to Hollywood are literal references to a geographical place. So Hollywood is a suburb of Los Angeles, but only 7 out of 100 actually use the word Hollywood to refer to the place. So here's one example: Brad Pitt's aging West Hollywood bungalow. So this is a literal reference to the house in the suburb of Hollywood where the film star Brad Pitt lives. Oops, what's happened here? Ah, there we are. I thought I had a disaster for a moment there. Over 90%, so 93%, are metonymic references to the film industry and famous studios and stars. Hollywood legend, Audrey Hepburn. Hollywood's golden age. Hollywood's portrayal of Vietnam. Hollywood heartthrob. Hollywood stardom. So in all of these examples, the place, the suburb of Los Angeles, the suburb of Hollywood, is taken to represent everything in the film making, the movie industry. And this is, this graph here shows the typical collocations which we find with the word Hollywood. The most frequent collocation is Hollywood stars or star. The second most frequent collocation is Hollywood movie. The third is Hollywood films. And the last there is Hollywood heartthrob. There are, of course, other collocations, but I've just taken the 4 collocations which occur more than 10 times here. These are right-hand collocates with frequency greater than 10. In the 1,501 occurrences of Hollywood in the BNC 1994 informative data set. So in this case, I've looked at all of the 1,501 examples and to see what significant collocations occur. And don't forget that what the computer is doing here is it's not just saying these are the words which come next to the word Hollywood. It's actually saying these are the words which occur with statistical significance. In other words, they occur more than by chance, by random chance. These occur statistically significantly with the word Hollywood. So somewhere like Hollywood is a very good example of metonymy. I don't really know anything much about Turkey. I've only unfortunately ever been to Turkey on 2 occasions, but I'm sure you probably do the same as we do in our country with examples like the following. The British Prime Minister lives in a street in London called Downing Street, and very often you can open your newspaper or go to the news websites and you will see Downing Street has issued a statement. And you think, oh, so the street can speak. It would be very strange if it was the street actually speaking. Buckingham Palace has issued a statement. The White House has issued a statement. Now, in each of these cases, we take a most important building, either where the President of the United States lives or the Queen of the United Kingdom lives, Buckingham Palace, or Downing Street, where the Prime Minister lives. And these become representations of the whole government, the whole institution of the presidency or whatever. And Tuğçe, I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce your name. I'm terribly sorry. But Tuğçe says we say Ankara. So there you are. There you are. So Ankara is used to represent not the place where you all live, but the actual institute, the institution of the Turkish government. Thank you very much for that example. I will be able to use that if anybody ever invites me to give this talk somewhere else. I will be able to look like an expert on Turkish metonymy. Thank you, Tuğçe. So let's move on. So the point I want to make here is that metonymy is very ordinary. It is not something that only exists in high literature. In fact, the most common examples of metonymy are in our ordinary everyday lives. We don't see or hear such examples as extraordinary, humorous, visually impactful, or colorful. And this is the point that I want to make here, that when you pick up your newspaper and it says Ankara has issued a statement, or Downing Street has issued a statement, or the White House has issued a statement. You don't say, oh my goodness, there's a street that talks, there's a whole city that talks. So we have actually the opposite of what I was talking about earlier. That earlier I said figurative language depends on salience, and salience makes it stick out in the text in some ways. But now we're saying that these metonyms don't stick out. Metonyms are so ordinary that we don't even notice them. So if I pick up my newspaper and I see Downing Street has issued a statement, I don't think, oh my gosh, that's very colorful language. That's very creative, very beautiful. No, it's just terribly, terribly ordinary. So that's one thing that distinguishes metonymy from metaphor. Okay, so metaphors are salient in some ways. We notice them. We don't notice metonymy. Metonyms are typically unmarked. That is, they are heard as normal, neutral, and not standing out. Yeah. So if one police officer arrives at an accident and somebody says, oh, the police have arrived, plural, the police have arrived, we don't say, you're telling a lie, there's only one police officer here. Why are you lying to me? It would be a very strange reaction, because it is so ordinary, so normal to say, ah, the police are here. Now we can, you know, we can make a statement, we can organize things better, or worse, depending on the police force, of course. However, we can still create new metonyms, of course, and this is where we make the transition from ordinary everyday language into more specialized kinds of language. Unconventional, marked metonymy is always available to creative users of the language, such as poets, humorists, advertisers, and journalists, etc. So the situation is that metonyms are, for most of us, are very ordinary. They pervade our everyday life. They are there in everything, but we can still create new ones. And people who do this in particular are comedians, poets, advertising language. You know, you can pick up any advertisement and you can see how the advertisers will choose one feature of something to advertise that product, to represent that whole product. And journalists do the same. So it is almost certainly journalists who first began to use the word the White House instead of saying the President of the United States, or the President's office, or the President and his political party. It's very often journalists pick on these things and then they become very ordinary, and that's what's special about them. So back to the 3 M's. We're coming around in a circle now, and we're coming around almost to an hour, so I'm going to shut up in a couple of minutes, even though I could talk forever about this. Back to the 3 M's. And we're going to start with meronymy. Meronymy is the physical or abstract parts of something, so the parts of the body, the parts of a car, the parts of a tree, you know, the trunk, the branches, the leaves, etc. But they are often related to conceptual metaphors and to metonymy. So we saw that with the example of the human body. The human body has all these different parts, but conceptually we can use those parts to represent types of action, types of social behavior, and so on. These are the conceptual metaphors. And the actual expressions that come from the human body often involve metonymy. That is, they involve one part of the human body representing the whole human being. So examples from the body, the metaphors, the conceptual metaphors, the heart is the center of emotions. So we can talk about a broken heart. If you are extremely upset or sad because someone has died or your lover has left you, a broken heart. The eye is the center of interaction, yeah? Seeing eye to eye. The hand, the foot, and the toe are centers of behavior, of action. And we can do the same with trees and plants, for example. The roots of a tree or a plant conceptually represent origins. So I can talk about my roots, my family roots, the root of a problem, just where it came from. The branch represents growing and spreading. So obviously we can think of a company having branches in many different countries around the world. The trunk is the main extender, it's the main thing from which everything grows. So we talk about, in English, we talk about trunk roads. Trunk roads are big main roads with lots of small roads going off them. So if you look at a map of England, you can see some big trunk roads. Years ago, we don't do this anymore, but we used to call a long distance phone call a trunk call. It was a long way along, that, like the big trunk of a tree. But everybody has mobile phones now, and it doesn't matter if you're phoning somebody in the next room or somebody in Turkey or somebody on the other side of the world, all the phone calls are the same. Blossom on a tree or a plant represents positive growth. So a student, a child can blossom just as the flowers come onto a tree. So these, at the heart of Meronymy is a system of conceptual metaphors. The meronyms enable us to create these particular metaphors for certain human actions, certain human behaviors, certain human phenomena. Metaphor versus metonymy. So I hope by now we can see how meronymy works. Now we come back to metaphor versus metonymy. Metaphor is based on a source domain and the target domain. So for example, you might say, the mind is a container. My mind, it's like a box, it's like a bag, yeah? The box or bag of the mind is the source. That's where the metaphor can come from. So I start by thinking of my mind as a bag or a box. And when I communicate, the contents of the box come out, the context spills out. And if I do this without thinking, if I do it, where are we? I've lost that. No, I have to go back. Previous. If I do this inadvertently, if I do it without thinking, for example, if I let the cat out of the bag or I spill the beans, the target, what I'm trying to communicate to you is I am revealing a secret. I'm telling you something that I should not really tell you. So that's how metaphor works. You have a source. The source is the concept that my mind is a box or a bag. The target is, oh gosh, I've said something, I've told somebody some information I should not have told them. So in other words, the information has spilled out of my mind. It's like letting a cat out of a bag or like spilling a bag of beans. Okay, and that's how metaphors work. Metonyms are not based on this conceptually separate source and target domains. So it's not the mind and a bag or the mind and a box. The soldier is a member of the army. The White House is where the president of the USA lives and works. Ankara is the seat of government of Turkey, and so on. Soldier, army, White House. Soldier and army, White House and president, Ankara and government of Turkey, are related terms. The mind and the bag are not related. They are brought together in this conceptual metaphor. All right, so for me then it was becoming much clearer how all this works and how it all fits together. But I thought I'd go back to my preoccupation at the beginning of this talk, and that is, what's the public reality of all this? Now, you remember I said that you can't find everything in an ordinary dictionary like the Cambridge Dictionary or the Merriam-Webster Dictionary. So what I did was, excuse me, I should have a glass of water here, but I'll be okay. What I did was I looked at mentions of our 3 M's in the British National Corpus, 1994. So in other words, how often do people actually talk about metaphor or metonyms or meronymy? And I've taken the different forms on the left here: metaphor, plural, metaphors, the adjective metaphoric, and the alternative form metaphorical, and the adverb metaphorically, the noun metonym, plural metonyms, and the concept metonymy, and the adjective metonymic, and the noun meronym, plural meronyms, and the concept meronymy. I haven't got an adjective or an adverb here because I couldn't find any. And this is what I found. There were 2 examples in the whole corpus where someone mentioned meronymy. There were 12 examples of the word metonymic. There were 23 examples of metonym or metonyms and metonymy. By the way, I should mention that the BNC 1994, the British National Corpus 1994, is 100 million words. So we're getting some idea of how much these terms have penetrated the public consciousness. Metaphorical and metaphorically, there were 379. And metaphors, my goodness me, there were over 1,000 examples. So this surely tells us something. This tells us quite clearly that for the public, the non-academic world, metaphors are a reality. Metonyms, well, who knows? Just a small, tiny fraction. Meronyms, no, nobody ever talks about meronyms. So next time you go out for a cup of coffee with your friend, and you say, oh, I've got a cup, but I haven't got a saucer, don't say, I'll call the waiter and get one of the meronyms of cups and saucers, because your friends will probably say, I'm not going out with you talking like that. Or they may even immediately lose the will to live. So it's quite clear that the term metaphor has penetrated the public imagination, but these other terms, they are highly specialized, and we are the only people who understand them. That's all I've got to say, and there are the references that I've mentioned in this talk, and one that I recommend very highly, the work of Alice Degnan, who published 2 very useful things in 2005, and Alice's work is a very good example of using corpora in this precise area. So we have a corpus linguistic perspective on the relationship between metonymy and metaphor, which I found very, very useful. Then the Lakoff and Johnson and Janet Littlemore's book, and the book that I struggled so much to write, which should be out within the next 3 months, and it's called Vocabulary, the Basics. And that was what the publisher asked me to do, was to explain the basics. And that's extremely difficult. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mike, for a wonderful talk. It was full of inspiration. Yes. Yet another talk about the richness and the creative usages in everyday language, what you call vulgar, right? In a talk on spoken grammar, right?
Yes.
Our students are very much familiar with that. We've listened to that a couple of times. Okay, Mike, would you have a couple of minutes
Of course,
for
yes.
some questions, right?
Indeed, yes. And if you feel intimidated about speaking, just put something in the chat box.
Right.
Any comments? Yeah.
Thank you. So would anybody have any questions or comments about Mike's talk? Looks like Tuğçe is getting ready to ask a question.
If that's okay. Hiya.
Right. Oh, there you are.
Hello, Professor McCarthy. Thanks for this wonderful. I hope you can hear me, by the way.
Perfect. Yes.
Thank you. Thanks for your wonderful, wonderful webinar, and thank you, Nurdan Hocam, for bringing us this opportunity to meet this valuable professor. So, McCarthy, you mentioned about the conceptual domains and from which linguistic utterances and linguistic practices emerge. So, for example, body, we talked about body, and yes, body as the very core of our existence is universal. But I was wondering if it is possible to consider body or its targets, maybe not the source, maybe not the main domain, but the targets. Can we consider it more like a cultural practice that changes from culture to culture, or is it only universal, do you think?
That's a fantastic question, because it goes right to the heart. Oh, there we are. That's a metonymy, isn't it? It goes to the goes to the heart of the problem. And the answer is that I'm not entirely sure. I mean, my knowledge of other languages, unfortunately, my other languages are Spanish and Swedish, and I did Welsh at school. So all my languages come from either sort of very Western or Northern Europe. Oh, yeah. And when I was doing the research for this book, I looked at a number of examples of idiomaticity and metonymy and so on in Spanish and in Swedish. And certainly Swedish is very, very close to English, but then we shouldn't be surprised because, of course, you know, a lot of the English language came from the old Scandinavian cultures. You know, even as I showed, even in Shakespeare's time, the metonymic example that I took from Shakespeare, you know, referred to theatre, which of course goes back to ancient Greece and Turkey and the Mediterranean. What, of course, I can do is throw this back at you, because here I am with an audience of Turkish speakers, and ask you, you know, does this all seem very familiar? Something like, say, the human body. Is the heart the center of the emotions? Is the nose something that you use when you are invading someone's privacy? Is the eye something you use to talk about agreeing with someone? Is it? Can anybody offer answers? Not you, Tuğçe, because you asked the questions, so we're going to get the others.
Thanks ever so much. Thank you.
But it's a great question. Can I have some comments from you Turkish speakers here? Does it sound familiar to you? So in English, we can see eye to eye, and the eye becomes the metonym for harmony, agreement, seeing the world in the same way.
As I was listening to you, I mean, Turkish equivalents came to my mind immediately. So I was just wondering whether some of these would be actually universal. Okay, when we say, for example, aynı gözle bakmak, kulak vermek. Okay, so to lend an ear, or probably to see eye to eye. I think we've got some very similar examples. I don't know if anybody else would agree with me. Burnunu sokmak, to interfere with somebody. Indeed, it's always about the nose.
The nose, yeah. Yeah, and I suppose we shouldn't be surprised at that, as Tuğçe says, because the body is something we all share as human beings. It might be also interesting to look at other areas. So I took, for example, we're talking about the meronyms of trees and plants. And these are used metonymically, you know, to express the whole notion of a growing organism. So, you know, we talk in English about a company, a bank, for example, having branches. Would you use the same word in Turkish? Do you take the metaphor of a tree? You do?
Yes, we do. And I think this is the reason why they are, I mean, they look like universal, because what we see in nature and on Earth, they are very similar. And like the body, human body, and the trees, or whatever we see in nature, that they are most probably common in any language.
Yeah. Okay, so thank you, Tarkan. So Tarkan's point is a good one, that we all see the same kinds of phenomena on the planet. We see plants and flowers and so on. What about something like, the one that interests me is something like a car. Okay, so we take a motor car. We can talk in English about being, about somebody driving something through. So a politician can drive a policy through Parliament. I can be accused, if I'm giving you advice that you don't need, you can accuse me of being a backseat driver. I can talk about steering you towards my point of view. I can talk about getting into gear. Yeah, if I have a plan and it takes a long time to get started, I can say, oh, well, we haven't really got into gear yet. So all of these are parts of the car which are used to represent the whole notion of driving forward, moving forward. Is that something you do in Turkish as well?
That's a difficult question. I couldn't think of anything about the cars, actually. Can anybody think of anything similar? Probably no.
There's a comment on the chat.
Oh, there's a comment on the chat box.
Oh, right. Sorry.
Yokuşu making something much harder. Okay, so to drive your car or drive something up the hill. Okay, to make something more difficult for somebody, probably.
Aha. Okay. Yeah. So I think Tarkan and Tuğçe have both made an important point here, and that is that there is an element of universality, because even if you live in a very primitive tribe and have never seen a car, you can be sure that you've seen trees and plants and flowers, and you can be sure you've seen human bodies. So we probably have a kind of layering, a fundamental feature of our human experience, which is our body and our environment. And then you have all these other things like cars. And another example, of course, would be computers, most recently using computers as a source domain for metaphors. So, you know, we can talk about some of the metaphors. I'm thinking especially of social media, you know, how some of these have transferred across. Just thinking about this the other day. You can talk about booting up a plan, for example, which comes from the idea of booting up a computer. And actually, the interesting thing about computers is they actually reflect back on how we think of our own minds. So a lot of debates, recent debates about the nature of the mental lexicon, that is how we store vocabulary in our minds, how we can have 10,000 English words or 50,000 Turkish words up there in our head somewhere, that we often use computers to understand that. We talk about storage, we talk about the mind as a kind of database, the mind being in some ways like a computer. We can store words, we can retrieve them, you know. And I suppose as each technological development takes place, it offers us different opportunities for metaphorical for creating conceptual metaphors. I think that might be the answer to the question, Tujay. I'm not entirely sure. You know, you've asked a good question. You've asked the right question, and I would be bluffing if I said, "Oh yes, I know exactly how it works in all the other languages in the world." I don't. But what I do know is that you know, a lot of these basic conceptual metaphors are shared across many cultures. But obviously advanced technological cultures will probably use advanced technology as sources of figurative language. Thank you very much for that question. That was really a good one.
Right. Would there be any other question?
Doesn't have to be a question, could just be a comment.
Yeah, indeed. There could be a comment as well.
They're even better, because if it's a question, I have to answer it.
I've got a short question, actually, if I may. I was just wondering about your observations regarding the non-native speakers English in terms of the 3 N's, either in their conversational language or in written language. Have you noticed anything interesting which is sort of worth sharing?
Yeah, well, I look at this from 2 points of view. Firstly, that I myself have been a non-native speaker of 2 European languages. I've lived in Spain and I've lived in Sweden. And in both situations, I was a non-native learner, a non-native speaker of those 2 languages. Then, of course, over my career, I have taught many thousands of non-native users of English. And one thing that does come out very strongly from both points of view is that we hesitate, and I think this relates to Tujay's point, we hesitate to transfer figurative language to the language that we're learning. Even though I discovered many years later that Swedish and English share so many idiomatic expressions, so very similar. When I was living in Sweden, even after living there for 5 years, I think my language was still very literal. You know, I didn't dare to use the metaphorical or idiomatic expressions. And I certainly would never have guessed, if my teacher had not told me, that, you know, I could use the eye or the ear or the heart or these things. So I think it's perfectly natural for learners of a second language to be very literal. It is only when you reach an advanced level that you take these risks. And it's not because you're not allowed. I mean, I think this argument about, you know, second language learners are outside of the culture. You know, they shouldn't use idioms because they are appropriating cultural ownership of the other language. I think that's nonsense. What it is all about is exactly the point that Tujay has been making, and that is that because your language and your culture are inseparable when you're a child and you're growing up, it takes quite a big leap, quite a big risk to say, oh, well, if I can do this in Turkish, I can do it in English. Because you don't know if you can. That's the whole point. I think what this means in terms of language teaching is that you have to give learners opportunities at least to take risks. When they take those risks, they may succeed and create something beautiful, or they may fall flat on their face. That's a metonym. You don't fall on your face, the whole body falls. They fall flat on their face and the whole thing fails, and it's a disaster. But the language classroom is a very good place for allowing people to take risks.
Indeed.
Because there is no shame or embarrassment involved if you do something crazy, do something stupid. And
That's right, Lacan.
Tujay's put up an interesting quote. We don't speak language, we are spoken by the language. Was that Lacan? I think it was, but that's a great quote.
Talked about that last week in our PhD class, didn't we?
Did you really? Yeah.
Mm.
Do you want to enlarge a bit on that, Tujay? Could you just talk a little bit more about that? This is fascinating.
Sorry about that. My mic was
muted.
So, well, I'm actually a person coming from both ELT background and literature background. So I was studying literary theories.
Me too.
Yeah, that's why I was so excited as well. And thank you, Nurdan Hocam, again for bringing this opportunity for us. So that was great. So I was interested in postmodernist theories, especially because I'm a language teacher. Obviously, I was trying to take these practices into my pedagogical practices or research area. So Lacan was one of the postmodernists that I was very interested. I am actually still very interested in it, although I'm not actively researching on it now. Partly because partly because he is a linguist as well, if I'm not mistaken. And these metaphor and metonymy, according to Lacan, I mean, how he was interpreting metonymy and metaphor was from the domain of the human psyche. And he claims that the unconscious is structured like a language. That's why the metonymy and metaphor actually is a very cognitive category rather than just being a mere linguistic practice.
Yes.
And well, we are all socially constructed beings. So we are not the subject of our speech, but we are subjected to the language. That was the main idea. That's why I remember when you were talking about metaphors and metonymies, I was just remembering my PhD years when we were studying Lacan. So.
Well, one of the things that we must do more of, you know, I've been in this profession now for decades. I started in 1966. I think most of you weren't even born in 1966, but that's when I started as my first teaching job. And at that time, teaching English was seen as teaching two things: the language and the literature. And so I was a literature teacher. My own PhD is in comparative literature. It's not in linguistics. And the idea was that you accessed language by looking at the literature, which enabled you to access the cultural construction of the Spanish person or the Swedish person or the French person, whichever literature we were studying. What happened, and I've always regretted this, was in the late 1970s and early 1980s, the communicative movement came along and said, oh, literature, no, that's irrelevant. All we need to do is to learn language forms. And I think that was a big mistake. I really do. And what you have just said, Tujay, underlines this. That if we are to understand a language, we have to understand the people who are spoken by it, the people who are subjected to it. You know, the language is not an objective, abstract set of forms. And we never thought that until about 1980. And then in about 1980, everybody said, oh yes, it's just a code. It's just a code. And English is a code which can belong to everybody. It's not the property of English speakers. It's not the property of Brits or Americans or Australians. You can treat it as a code with which to communicate. But okay, that's true to a certain extent. And millions of people around the world survive by learning the English code. Yeah, English as a lingua franca. Perfectly fine. I don't object to that. But there is something inside me which says, when I learned Spanish, when I learned Swedish, and when I learned Welsh, what was really important was getting inside, as you put it, getting inside the constructed human being that uses Welsh, that uses Spanish, that uses Swedish. The great thing about a department like yours, as I understand it, and I know Nurdan very well, is that you are prepared to think outside of that box. You are prepared to embrace things like language and literature, and in your case, language and culture, language and philosophy, language and postmodernist thought. So get that in there. Don't all be, please don't think that, you know, you can crack a language. And that's a metaphor, isn't it? Like you crack an egg and open it. You can crack a language by simply looking at it as a code. And I have to say here that corpus linguists are often very guilty of that. They see language as a system of, you know, counting things, counting frequency, counting collocations, counting chunks, and I've been guilty of that myself, and I think it's a mistake. That, okay, you can start by counting statistics about language, but when you have that statistical evidence, you have to make sense of it. It has to mean something. You have to understand it. And so, you know, I can give you statistics for the word Hollywood in the British National Corpus, but it's pointless unless we understand why those statistics are like that. What do they tell us? Well, they tell us that Hollywood has become a metonym, an ordinary everyday metonym. That's what we have to learn from that. I haven't got anything more to say.
Thank you very much. Okay, for the question.
So I will leave you. I will leave you. And before I go, I want to say how wonderful personally it is for me to make contact again with my dear friend Nurdan, who was one of the great memories I have of my years at Nottingham. Especially to meet Tarkan, who I've had a conceptual metaphor, a conceptual image of for many years. And great to meet your colleagues. Now, those of you who are doing PhDs, have a passion about it. Put your heart into the subject. Don't just put your nose in there, you know. Don't just dip your finger in the water. Yeah. In fact, don't use a metonym at all. Put your whole body and your whole brain and your whole mind and your whole life into it, because that's exactly what Nurdan did. I used to feel sorry for her, that she would come into the department looking as if she hadn't slept for about 5 days, because she worked so hard. I also remember, Nurdan, the first day you ever arrived in our department. Yes. When you came from Aberystwyth with your big suitcase. And yes. And you survived, and I hope you all survive in your PhDs, and I wish you all every success in the future. So I'll say goodbye.
Thank you very much, Mike, for a wonderful session. We're full of inspiration and full of ideas. Thanks a lot, and thank you everybody for joining us today. So hope to meet you again, probably in another session. Okay, we're so grateful. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Professor McCarthy, and thank you, Nurdan Hocam. It was really very nice event, and I learned a lot. And you know, in these days, creativity and innovation is a hot topic, and users of language. And I learned how we can contribute to the improvement of creativity in any job and in any learning setting.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you, Tarkan.
Creativity forever, Tarkan.
Thank you.
Give my best wishes to Jean, please.
I will indeed. Yes. I can hear the coffee machine going in the kitchen. So
all
that's
right.
Good news.
Good time for a cup of coffee then. Enjoy. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye now.
Thank you so much.
See you. Bye-bye, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Nurdan.
You're welcome. Pleasure, Hocam.